As with, I'm sure, many, including many law enforcement officers I've talked to, really the anger, the frustration, the sadness for the life that was taken of George Floyd and many others in situations that appear that there could have been a different outcome and a healthier outcome for all involved. There is real tension, understandable tension in our communities. We've had rallies, we've had protests in Vermont, and in the last couple of days, even some situations that have gotten a little more contested in St. Albans and St. Johnsbury. And I think we really need to all work to understand the underlying causes of what's going on, as well as work to create a better and stronger community going forward, not just with words, but with actions, with sentiments, with listening and learning. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to listen and learn from Captain Scott from the Vermont State Police. He's the Director of Fair and Impartial Policing and Community Affairs. And we're also going to be joined for the Vermont State Police. And we're going to be joined also by Susanna Davis, who's the Vermont Director of Racial Equity. And we're going to open by asking them to share a little bit about how the murder, and maybe for some that's a strong word, but of George Floyd and the protests taking place around the country, how is that connected to the work that each of you are doing here in Vermont? So I'll start with Captain Scott and the work you've been doing and maybe you're doing towards the future, and then Susanna as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, Lieutenant Governor. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And like many, this is an extremely upsetting event that occurred, and it's happened too many times. These are avoidable events that we as an agency and as a profession in law enforcement really have to listen to the communities we serve about what we can and how we should be doing it better. And this comes to training, this comes to lived experience, this comes to integrating all of those things as we work as a community to make our communities as safe as possible. So the state police has been involved in this type of work for a long time, since about 2005. We've had a committee of citizens since about 2009, a Fair and Impartial Policing Committee. And so this position officially was created in 2016, the Director of Fair and Impartial Policing, and essentially looks at all elements of our agency and how we can do a better job of making sure our members are thinking about racism, implicit bias, explicit bias, and we really rely on community partners to do the work. It's not coming from just us as an agency, it comes from our community members that have been with us for quite some time.
Thank you for that opening thought. And Susanna, why don't you explain a little bit what your role is, which as one person in a state of 600,000, you probably have more than you could do, but maybe you could explain what's your job?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. Buenos dias. So I am the executive director of racial equity for the state of Vermont. And this is a position that was created by an act of the legislature in 2018, signed into law by the governor in summer of 2018. And I officially began at the very, very end of July 2019. So I'm coming up on a year. And it is a job that is situated in the Agency of Administration, and its purpose is to oversee statewide collection of race data, identify any systemic disparities, racial disparities that may exist in state government, develop best practices and model policies on how to eradicate those disparities. I do a lot of presentations and education because I find that before I can start with step one, a step zero really is to help people understand, first of all, that this is a problem, and second, why it's a problem for Vermont specifically. That's been very rewarding work because I find that there are a lot of people who don't quite get it, but they want to get it. And once they understand it, I think that it incites in them a real desire to get involved. And to the second portion of your question, that's what I'm really noticing right now following the murder of George Floyd, is that so many people have been reaching out to me, colleagues in state government, people from outside government, members of the community from all over the state have been reaching out saying, I am white, this is wrong, what do I do? And so we're in a really powerful moment right now, not just nationally, but as a state. And I would love to see Vermonters really seize that moment and not lose the outrage that they're feeling right now, not lose that momentum, because we can get more into this later, but that's something that we see often, is that people are so upset for a while and then it fizzles out and we don't really accomplish the change that we set out to do.
Thank you. And I want to mention, I've asked you both how to be addressed because we have a society where we also use titles for some and not titles for others. And I just want to make sure folks are aware that I did ask both Captain Scott and Susanna how they would prefer to be addressed in this situation and conversation. And I think we're all learning that even things like titles and how we address people establishes some of the different situations of power, or more powerful, or less respect, or more respect. And so I think it's important for all of us as we have conversations with various people to ask, how they would prefer to be addressed. And I've done that in this situation. And I want to ask Susanna, what are some of the learned equity issues in Vermont, and what do you think are the most pressing right now that need to be addressed? Right now, we have a big conversation around policing and law enforcement, but there are issues of racial equity that go far beyond policing and law enforcement. And if you were to name the 30 most important things that are going on, because some people think there's only one or four or five, obviously I'm not asking you to name 30, but what do you think are some of the most pressing issues around equity in Vermont?
All right, so to the first part of your question, what have I learned so far? Perhaps the biggest equity issue in Vermont is that we still have too many people here who don't think there are racial equity issues in Vermont. I think that so often I hear the line, well, we can't have racism here because we don't have enough non-white people. And that in itself is the problem, right? You have to ask yourself, why are we not attracting and retaining people when all over the rest of the country they're able to live and thrive and grow? So that's perhaps the biggest equity issue, and the biggest challenge to this work is that so few people still recognize its existence and the need for it. And then, of course, yeah, when we think about racial inequity and structural racism, one of the first things that we think about is law enforcement and policing, because, I mean, look at where we are as a nation. Look at where we are every single year. Just as an aside, I remember before I came to Vermont, I lived in New York City for about a decade. And I remember about 2 years ago being on the train headed to work, and I saw a man wearing a t-shirt, and the t-shirt listed the names of many unarmed Black people who had been killed by police. And I remember thinking, that's really powerful. I want a t-shirt like that. And then I thought, it'll be outdated in 3 months. What's the point? And I wasn't wrong, right? So yes, we often first think about policing when we think about structural inequity, but truth be told, structural racism is far more sinister and far more widespread than that. I would say that housing, believe it or not, has been perhaps the biggest tool to keep people physically and socially segregated. And the reason I say that is because across the country, yes, including in our region, we had policies like redlining, which was a strategic manipulation of bank loans and other policies to keep certain people corralled in certain areas. They used to rate neighborhoods as being, and color code them as being more desirable or less desirable. And if you look at the actual maps from the 40s, it would say things like less desirable due to infiltration of Belgians or infiltration of Jews, or of course, if there were Black people in a neighborhood, it was automatically red. So that was a way that we kept people physically segregated, right? It also meant that nicer neighborhoods got more investment. They got trees, parks, libraries, civic centers. Other neighborhoods got bus depots, storage facilities, waste transfer facilities. That influenced property values, influenced where we were investing and divesting, and it influenced how we passed on wealth. The intergenerational transfer of wealth through home ownership is one of the biggest ways that people acquire wealth in the United States. And it is perhaps the biggest way that we have denied that ability to people of color. I'll stop there, but I suppose I would say after policing, I would say that housing and perhaps employment discrimination might be two other really big factors.
Thank you. And Captain Scott, I know you've been working on issues of implicit bias and potentially even racism issues, to name it directly within. Again, it's not just within law enforcement; it's across the society as a whole. But law enforcement, it's something that really needs to be reflected on in the attempts to treat people equally under the law. Can you talk about some of the issues you've worked on, some of the ways you've tried to address this, and things you see looking forward that could still use some work?
Yeah, I think you both have hit it right on the head. It starts with what type of person is coming into law enforcement, and we get our members from society. And we as an agency and as a profession have to make sure we start to really look at who we are bringing in to wear the uniform and what are their beliefs, and they're going to meet the values and core values that we expect of a Vermont state trooper or a local agency. So it really starts with who we're bringing into our agency and how we recruit them. And externally, what we're showing is imagery. Are we showing through our social media, through our interviews, and just communication with the public, this is what we are as an agency, and it's got to be reflective in the people who want to join us too. So recruiting is a big part of how we start to go down this path of getting someone to be a state trooper, and that they understand the values that we want them to have when they're out there in the public. So we've tried to recruit outside of the state to get more people of color to come here. It's difficult across the board in all businesses in Vermont to get young people to stay in Vermont and to come here and work. So that's one of the challenges we continually face. But when we get an applicant that has tested, taking a look at the test, what type of racial or implicit bias that are right in there in testing. We've seen challenges there when it comes to communities of color. After the person does pass the exam and they come in for an oral board interview, we make sure that we are asking questions, scenario-based questions, so we could start to, one, understand the thinking of that applicant, and for also messaging to them that they understand our values with these types of scenario-based questions when they come to racism and implicit bias and LGBT issues. So if they eventually are hired, we then use community members. Dr. Eitan Nasreddin Longo, he's the chair of our state police Fair and Impartial Policing Committee and the Attorney General's Racial Disparities Committee. He does implicit bias training with our recruits. Curtis Reed, who's been in Vermont for a long time, does training with our recruits. We have strong policies that we have put in for fair and impartial policing. So it's ongoing. Our senior command level have all taken implicit and explicit bias training. We bring in Director Davis to speak to our senior commanders about what she is seeing in the state. So a lot of it is community-based learning and implementing that into our policies and in our training. So we are going to be reflective of what Vermonters want from the state police agency. So and we've been doing it for a long time, but there's no flag to be planted, and there's still lots of work to be done, obviously. And there's always challenges that go along with that. And it's not easy, but we need our members to really listen actively and participate in this and not be silent about what's happening nationally.
Yeah, and I've gotten some questions lately, and I get calls at the Lieutenant Governor's office. I get calls at home because I've been public about my number for 20 years. Now that I'm statewide, it makes my phone ring a lot. But questions about local law enforcement versus state law enforcement and rules or laws that should be applied maybe statewide in terms of laws governing law enforcement, not the laws that govern the general population, although that's also true. Can either of you comment to some of the challenges of the, we've got sheriffs, we have some municipal law enforcement, we've got the Vermont State Police. What's being done to coordinate some of these efforts across different jurisdictions? And I don't know if either one, which one of you or both have some to offer on that conversation.
I could start, and I'm sure Director Davis can as well answer, but that's difficult. Exactly what you mentioned is a challenge. We have elected sheriffs, right? So they have a community base of people that are reflecting what they want in their community as a law enforcement agency. Then we have town constables, which are few and far, but they are out there doing things, again, selected by that town to work in there and generally do traffic enforcement or sort of civil orders. Municipal agencies can pick their police chiefs any which way they want, and the state police. So there's multiple layers and lots of ways to go. But for police training in Vermont, we're pretty unique, where every law enforcement officer that is full-time certified goes to one police academy. That's not the same throughout the rest of the country. So there are opportunities there where we can standardize our training. We do. Should it be expanded? I think it should, and it should be a bigger part of the curriculum. I think we're seeing that over and over and over again. I know we hear the comments about use of force, firearms training, and one thing I really want to urge through all that is always during use of force or de-escalation is always the primary goal in that training over and over again, whether it comes to motor vehicle law and a traffic stop, to criminal investigations, to physical confrontations, to deadly use of force with weapons. Verbal de-escalation is always part of those conversations and part of the training. Now, should they be updated and changed? I think that there's always new science that comes along with that, and we should constantly be looking how we can do it better.
Director Davis, I'll use that term. I think it sounds good on you.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of feedback from people around the state with their thoughts about the actual disconnect between policing policy at the state level and policing policy at the county and municipal levels. I am not ordinarily a cookie cutter thinker. That is, I do think that solutions should be tailored to the communities they're for. So ordinarily, I believe that there should be differences at different levels and in different places based on the needs of people. However, when it comes to things like law enforcement and policing, I believe that in order to maintain fairness across a system, there needs to be a greater degree of uniformity across that system. People should be able to expect that if you're in a town and you have an encounter with a local law enforcement officer, county level law enforcement officer, or state law enforcement officer in that same town, that encounter should follow the same track, more or less, regardless of whose car it is who's pulling you over. or stopping you, or whatever the case is. So to some extent, when we talk about law, and that's not just policing, it's also, we do this in the justice system. That's why we have what we call precedent, right? Because we want to treat like cases similarly. The trouble comes when we have different agencies and departments that have their own views on what fairness is, what equity is, what is evidence-based, and whether evidence-based even matters. And so justice and law enforcement is one arena in which I do very strongly feel that uniformity is important, because we want to make sure that people can trust the system to deliver consistent results.
Thank you. I've gotten a lot of calls from folks, and it sounds like you both may have. Director Davis, you've talked about a lot of calls lately of people calling to say, what can I do? How can I help? How do I get involved? How do I use my voice to push for changes to the system that appear needed? Can either of you talk to sort of the best way for folks to get involved? You know, there's a process and a term, being woke, that I sort of think of that term as a goal for a destination, but one that very few of us will ever achieve. But that it's a process of continuous awakening and becoming aware. Director Davis, you mentioned that to begin with. If people don't even recognize that there is racism, even in the comment that you mentioned earlier of how can we have racism? We don't have people of color here. It's, those folks are maybe a little earlier on the path than some others. But a lot of people seem to have been being shaken from a little bit of the complacency slumber. What are some recommended ways people could be involved, helping law enforcement be better, and or helping with some of these other aspects, Susanna, that you talked about with respect to racism in our state?
There are so many ways to get involved, and it really, you can do things to your ability and within your comfort level, but what is not an option anymore is remaining quiet and saying, well, I'm neutral and at least I'm not hurting anybody, so I'm okay. If you are providing a friction-free environment for others to discriminate, then you are providing safe passage for people who discriminate. You are tacitly approving of the behavior. And that's how it happens more often than not. It's because someone does something they shouldn't do, and the people who witness it choose not to intervene. And that is how these incidents often play out in our daily lives. People often ask themselves, well, you know, I don't know, I don't think it was racist, or maybe it was, and they see it as very black and white. I think that whether something is racist or not is perhaps not the most constructive question. I would urge people to ask themselves instead, how much racism do I tolerate on a daily basis? Or rather, in this particular instance, how much racism was at play? I think thinking about it like that is much more impactful, because it reminds people that there are a lot of different instances of racial discrimination that we live with every single day. Someone close to me was in a Napa Auto Parts a couple of months ago here in Vermont, and heard the guy at the counter at the next cashier say, yeah, I need the such and such part because it looks like somebody nigger rigged it on my car. You can either choose to say something when you hear something like that in a store, or walk off because you feel comfortable in your white skin, not feeling like you need to intervene, right? So it's things like that. Do you speak up when you hear that kind of thing? When you notice that a brown person in the store is being followed and watched, do you say something to management to say, hey, I noticed it and it's not right? I know that happens to me all the time. Would people feel comfortable noticing that happening to me and not saying anything? You can contact your local and state and federal representatives and say, hey, at your level, are we outfitting officers with body-worn cameras? Are we using dash cam footage? Do we use evidence-based de-escalation techniques? Do we give warnings before we shoot? You know, how do we handle it when an officer is found to have been committed abuse? You can do things like do an audit of the media that you have in your home, books, TV shows that you watch, movies, music. What do you expose your children to? Look at who are the characters in their books. I'm reminded of one children's book that, you know, it's like tracing the letters to teach children how to write. and the words happy and proud had white-skinned children's photos with them, and the words sad and angry had dark-skinned children's photos associated with them. So do an audit of the media in your home. Are you setting an example? Who do you invite over for dinner? Do you expose yourself or your children to people who are different than you, different religions, different ethnic groups? So there's a lot that you can do. And one thing that I always hear is, yeah, but I don't know any brown people. Where they're not around. How can I invite someone to dinner or whatever? And I can't buy that in 2020. That's not an excuse anymore. I can talk to people in Japan. I don't understand how we can live where we live, surrounded by so many other metropolitan and multicultural areas, and still not have the ability to seek out more cultural exposure.
And maybe Captain Scott, how does one communicate with the Vermont State Police and offer constructive criticism or ideas that you could incorporate? And even one thing I've heard, and this is along these same lines, a number of people have been calling my office saying, demilitarize the police, the weaponry and some of the armaments that have been used and are not necessarily used, but have certainly been purchased for and are part of your arsenal, to be perfectly honest, as a term, have been elevating over time. So how do people reach out to you and talk to you about, is that necessary? Why do you need that? What, or other questions they may have, and ideas and criticisms, and compliments, of course, as well. But how do people make change in the way we do law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I hear it often. I think that I would encourage Vermonters to look right at our webpage, and you'll see a lot of our values right out there. We have a fair and impartial policing position, right? So that's on there. We have a way to make complaints about troopers right on our webpage, and you can do that through all of our social media outlets. And we have data that's put up on our webpage. Our traffic stop data will be released the next few weeks. The pandemic is going to slow it down this year, but normally every year in June, we put our traffic stop data up there. We put up officer involved shooting data on our webpage. So a lot of these answers are right there, and you'll see the values that are important to a law enforcement agency about how they sort of present themselves out in the world. So I really would encourage a lot of people to, if they have questions, to look there. The tools and the equipment that we use, and I get what people say, they see a large truck, it's armored coming through their community. There's the flip side of that too, and that is, we live in Vermont where there are a lot of high-powered firearms and people have weapons, and we've seen it nationally and around the country that the weapons are already there in people's hands. And unfortunately, shootings have gone up, and shootings are just one sort of metric, but the firepower that's being used against our troopers is more significant than we've had before. This is just within the last year, we have finally moved away from shotguns up to a more semi-automatic weapon, because that's what we're seeing when we go into confrontations with people that are shooting at the police. So we're trying to balance that the best we can. We get it completely that we don't want to be an occupying force in the state of Vermont. That's not anywhere near where we want to be. And there's a lot of thought that goes into when those resources are put onto the streets. And when they're put out there, it sends a message, and it can be very frightening to the public. And there's a lot of thought to the commanders about how and when we use them and how we should be using them and when we're even purchasing them. So it's a balancing act. It's difficult, but we also want to make sure our members are safe, and we do a lot of work to try to make that as the best we can. But we get it. We hear the message loud and clear, but it's a difficult balancing act sometimes when it comes to those type of tactics.
Yeah, I heard, to follow up on that a little bit, I've heard from a number of people that even just the sort of the titles that are used in law enforcement are parallel to the titles that are used in the military, and whether or not that creates a mindset or not. You know, again, we are impacted, as Director Davis said, by images and words over our whole lifetime. When I opened up as Lieutenant Governor 4 years ago, I talked about how I'm a farmer, so I gave out a dry bean to every senator and said, every single bean has the potential to be a thriving plant, but the soil it's in, the environment that it's raised in, is really going to impact how that plant ends up in terms of thriving and productive or withering or whatnot. And over time, instances can, too much rain, too little rain can affect that. We are the result of a societal system of information. Um, and of course, the bean was a metaphor for children, right? Nobody's born racist. Nobody is born with various, directions and thoughts and motives in mind, but we're shaped. And I'm wondering about the terminology in law enforcement, back to what I was starting with. And if there's been any thought to that in terms of what do we call, like, we call it the Vermont State Police, not maybe a more aggressive term. So I think even the term is, or we say public safety in terminology. Terminology matters. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that within the force, what you've looked at in terms of terminology.
Of course so. And, we were designed, our first commissioner was Merritt Edson. He was a World War II Congressional Medal of Honor winner, and our uniforms are based on the Marine Corps. So yes, we definitely have that ingrained into the culture of the state police. And there's ways there and how to move groups of troopers from spot to spot. But the long term and where we evolve to now is really having conversation with the individual troopers. We cover, one trooper usually is covering large areas of Vermont by themselves. And the language and training and culture we want them to be thinking about, these are our neighbors, these are our friends, these are our families. This is the community we live in. And you should be treating your community the way you would want to be treated and see that reflected in. And so, yeah, there are definitely long-term things we need to think about as we move forward with policing. And those are topics in there. That's been a long history of how police has sort of been designed and developed, but the long term is the culture within those agencies and how they are projecting out to the public is a long-term conversation we should be having.
Well, we're nearing the end of the half hour that I asked you both to contribute to this conversation. And I'm going to add one quick thought that came in that was seen on another social equity conversation. There are tremendous conversations happening. I was on about a 1,200 person conversation. Well, it was a panel that 1,200 of us watched. I was not on the panel just a couple of nights ago. But a comment has come in that was sent to the Social Equity Caucus from Chief Don Stevens of the Naldegan Band of the Cossack Abnaki Nation, saying, we are all in this together with respect to making sure communities, not just Black and brown, but many communities are included, and the Indigenous population wants to be certainly not forgotten in the conversation around health disparities. We're talking about law enforcement issues in particular right now with Captain Scott, but the broader conversation with Director Davis. And we have health issues of disparities in access to care and disparities in disease rates, COVID-19, 2-to-1 ratio, with respect to communities of color being impacted compared to those of us that are white. Zuzana talked about housing. And I just want to give you each a minute to close, just to say, what do you think is needed for us to grow from this experience, which, as Zuzana pointed out, is it's an ongoing experience. This one is a highlighted experience. This is the straw that broke the camel's back yet again. It's happened, Rodney King. It's happened, Eric Garner. It's happened, Brianna, over and over and over again. But we're in a moment right now when we can grow from this. What would be your closing thought, and where do we go? What can we do from this to really shift this systemic challenge?
There's so much to say. And
I know it's impossible.
Yeah, and first of all, I want to echo what Chief Stevens said, because he's 100% right. When we think about racial equity in America, we often think about Black Americans and white Americans and the legacy of slavery. And that's understandable because it's still very painful and very fresh and a very deep legacy. But we live in a time where, we have Asian people, we have Latinos, we have Indigenous people who are the only ethnic group who are asked to prove their ethnicity on their own soil, right? So yes, we are absolutely in it together. And then you get into intersectionality and it's just a whole nother ballgame, right? I would say that what's really important is that dominant group members recognize that equity requires the relinquishing of unearned and unjust privilege. It's not going to be easy for any of us. And growing might feel like breaking at first. But you cannot say that you stand for equity if you don't want to let go of your inequitable privilege. So I would just say, prepare for discomfort, but push past it because it's necessary and it's a step we cannot skip. I have one more thing, I'll be really quick. Vermont, we really, really have to do better about our insular and exclusionary attitudes. We need people from outside the state, and continuing to have an attitude that we don't is hurting us in the long run. Our population is not growing, it is aging, our schools are closing and merging left and right. It is clear that in order to sustain ourselves and to stay afloat, we've got to be more welcoming to people.
Yeah, I think to sort of jump on that as well is that I would ask that the public, if you see a trooper or an officer out there, to engage them in a cordial conversation and really get their viewpoints of what they believe and what's happening. I think a lot of times people are so intimidated and afraid of the police, they don't want to speak to them and to hear really what the feeling is of that agency and that particular officer. So I think you'll see that within our agency, we have a group of troopers that have formed an informal leadership program to tackle this issue within the state police, where they host sort of lunchtime discussions with each other and talk about the day-to-day topics, share articles from news sources that they wouldn't normally see. And I think that we're starting to see a significant change. The younger troopers that we're getting to apply and join our force have had a lot of these conversations already through their lives. So this is not new to them. It's new to people like me that are almost 50 years old and have to adapt to this. So our younger workforce is ready to make these changes, and they're engaged in it, and it's been powerful to see, and they're bringing good ideas to our organization.
Well, I really want to thank you both. We went over a little bit. I know we could go on for another couple hours, and if not days, for the importance of the conversation and the breadth and depth of these issues. I really appreciate the words that both of you have shared. I look forward to more conversations, not just with the two of you, but with fellow citizens all across Vermont about how we can each explore our own heritage, what burdens and what privileges we carry, and how to dismantle those and really work towards an equitable society of opportunity and equal justice and treatment under the law. So thank you both for your time today, and thank you folks for watching. I think we had 60 or 80 people on Facebook at one point, and folks often will watch these later as well, and I encourage folks to reach out. I think all three of us are accessible, but I also know that Director Davis is a team of one. Captain Scott, I think in your role, you're a team of one, although you're part of a larger force. And everyone does try to get back to everyone who communicates with us, but have some patience as well as we go through these struggles. We all have to dig deep as well. So thank you both for joining. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.